Hi, this is Ofori, the digital reader, and today what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to be recommending some books that are superhero fiction. Um, Superhero fiction is the favorite type of genre I like to read, and I kind of often feel that superhero fiction kind of gets the same reputation that romance does, where people will say, I'm not into romance, and they don't realize all of the subgenres that are built into romance books. And to be honest, I totally did not realize all the subgenres that were in romance books until I started looking at booktubers and looking at what they would be recommending. I didn't know that there was mob romance, and there's fantasy and science fiction, and then there's meet cute, just a whole range of different ways that you can do romance. That I used to think that, romantic books I wouldn't enjoy because I always knew how they were going to end up. But I kind of overlooked that the writing that's involved and the journey is a big part of, what people like about romance books. And I have one on my slate to read. Obviously, there are going to be some that may not be my cup of tea, but now I'm not just kind of saying I'm not interested in them as a whole because I'm not into romance. And I feel that a lot of times with superhero fiction, people go, I'm not really into superheroes, so I'm good. But there's just a whole range of different type of stories being told about people with superpowers, and because they're being told in books, there's tons of different layers to them. Now, obviously, there are going to be some books that, just like romance, that are on the lighter, more straightforward, good versus evil, I fly, therefore I am kind of books. And I'm going to kind of go over some of the books I'm going to recommend, and some of them are kind of really going to point to a little bit of a journey in my life with how I came to superhero fiction, and also some books I would recommend to people who kind of want to dip their toe into superhero fiction and kind of see what it's like depending on what their tastes are. So I'm going to start the journey with a book that kind of shows some of the interesting things that can happen in the superhero genre. It's a book series called H.E.R.Os. It is excellent book series called H.E.R.Os. And the kind of twist here is that basically the world has been bad science things happened, and the world now is full of zombies. This was a world with heroes, so basically what happens is all these enclaves form where, they're like holdouts against the zombie horde, and these enclaves are generally protected by people who used to be superheroes in the old world before the zombie apocalypse. It's an awesome story because, let's just be honest, superheroes, zombies, why didn't somebody think of it before? And it's exciting, it's gritty, it's kind of like, it's not like a ton of superheroes, and these are kind of superheroes who are just kind of like, the zombies are so many that's even a challenge to them. So the H.E.R.O series is just a really, really good series. I would say, this is a good series for somebody who is looking for action. They're looking for something a little bit grittier. Not a ton of romance going on, but this would be somebody who might lean a little bit more towards maybe science fiction, maybe towards action and adventure. Or it's not really a ton of horror, but if you've read zombie books before, then this would also be interesting to you. The next book that I would recommend is H.E.R.O Metamorphosis. H.E.R.O Metamorphosis is the closest thing I would say to kind of like a cozy hero book. I generally consider, quote, cozy books to be books that are, a large part of it is about a process that the heroes are undertaking that is a low stakes process, and their journey researching, refining, and succeeding in that mundane process. So Hero Metamorphosis is the first of 20 hero books. So these books are also very much like a super, super, super in-depth comic book series. They're a little bit on the lighter side. They're not as deep as deep into some of the motivations and psyche as some of the books, some of the superhero books that I'm going to be talking about. But it's basically about these three college students who they are in this meteor shower, and the meteor shower gives them superpowers, and it's kind of about how they deal with it, how they get their costumes, how they register to be superheroes, the training they have to go through, all that kind of stuff to kind of be up to speed. And then the later books, they're forming teams, and then villains get involved, and they have some stories there. So it's really a full-fledged series that has many different characters and stories, but that maybe the first two books are really more cozy in that you kind of settle in. It's really the reason I like this book, and for me, I like this book, and I think a lot of people might like it, is because the way they take you through the first two books, it's very much kind of like, what would you do in your normal life if you're walking down the street and you just got superpowers? How would you handle it? What would be the next thing you would do? So that's why I like this series, and I think it's a good, kind of cozy entry into superhero prose, but it is definitely not for people who are looking for something deep or looking for something with a lot of layers, a lot of gray, that kind of thing. This is not the book for them. The next book is pretty much a superhero prose classic. Soon I Will Be Invincible. A lot of people kind of call it the first real superhero fiction book that was not a book written based off of a comic or a movie, a superhero movie, or a superhero graphic novel. It's an original story, and this is where you get into humor, you get into darkness, you get into motivations. It really turns kind of a superhero trope on its head, because it tells two stories. It tells the story of a supervillain called Dr. Impossible, who is super smart and super strong, and he's currently in jail. He's been captured, and it kind of details his attempts to try and take over the earth for the 13th time. So his chapters are talking about his path to that, and then the other chapters, and they're kind of split, the other chapters talk about a young new superhero called Fatale, and she is a new member of a group called the Champions, and it details her experience in the Champions, and of course inevitably Dr. Impossible and the Champions meet, and it kind of takes their stories from both sides, his side and her side, and all the things that occur. This is, like I said, it's a classic. I would say if you are a science fiction fan, if you're a fantasy fan and you're reading science fiction and fantasy, that are exciting and about magic and you like different magic systems and stuff like that, then I think this might be a good book for you to kind of start off with, especially if you've seen a couple superhero movies or you know a little bit about superheroes, maybe even have read some comic books. This is a good starting point because it does take a lot of superhero tropes and really plumb into them and kind of say, well, what's going on here? Like, why does this guy need to continue to try and take over the world? The next book is another classic, I consider it more of a classic because it was first. You can see I gave it 3 stars. So I thought it was good, but not great. Wild Cards is basically a group of short stories about different heroes in this imaginary world. And Wild Cards is definitely on the darker side. Wild Cards is gritty. The heroes' powers are often mid to low level. There's just a lot of intrigue and politics going on. This is definitely a deeper, darker hero series. I generally like the first 3 books, then it gets a little bit off the rails for me, but that's also because I generally like a little bit lighter fare when I'm reading my superhero prose, and this gets kind of dark, and is have a good deal of, in some of the later books there's a good deal of cheesecake, and cheesecake is what my dad used to always call sexy stuff. We'd be watching something and go, oh, that's too much cheesecake going on there. So sex scenes and stuff like that. But if you're into a little bit of a darker things, if you're into more political stuff, then Wild Cards might be something that you'd be interested in. Now we're kind of going to be talking about basically what formed my love of hero prose. This is my hero prose pulp fiction holy grail. When I read Doc Savage, Man of Bronze, I probably was anywhere between like 8 and 10. And I hadn't even started reading comic books yet. And I read this and it blew my mind. The exotic locations, this guy who was super smart, he was strong, he had like the body control of the yogis, and then the other cool part is he has this band of henchmen. The best way I can kind of liken it is it's kind of like maybe like an 18 kind of vibe, or when I think about it, there's a series out on Prime Video called Reacher. It's kind of like that, where he's like this man amongst men, and then he has like people around him. He has a guy who can fight, and this guy knows the streets. He has a guy who is like a dandy, and he has a cane and a sword, but he knows all about society stuff. So he has a bunch of henchmen around him who all are kind of expert in one thing, and he's an expert in everything. I won't even say he's like Batman, and he just kind of knows everything, and like I said, he has the body control and all that. And what he basically does, he's not really a hero, he's more of an adventurer. He definitely goes after criminals. He tries to solve mysteries. He travels the world and goes to Tibet and all these places. So it is a pretty world-spanning as you go through all the books. And this, I don't know if I mentioned, of course I have, this is My Neighborhood Train, so you might hear that in the background. But this book completely affected my reading habits for the next 50 years. I've read probably, I would say, between like 8 and maybe 15. I've probably read about 20 of his books, and they just, even after I started reading comic books, I still would go back to his books just because I just loved it, and they would add characters. He has like a niece who kind of gets involved, and it's just a really good series. It might not be to everybody's taste, but if you have any interest in pulp action or pulp fiction, you have to read The Man of Bronze. Now, The Shadow is good. He is another precursor to superhero fiction. I think of The Shadow more as a spy than a detective or a superhero. I actually kind of think, like I said, Doc Savage to me is much more of kind of an adventurer superhero, where The Shadow is kind of more of a spy. He's got guns, he's got he's got contacts and things like that. It's a good read, and I think a lot of people might enjoy it. For me, the main reason why I didn't like the Shadow was he just was a little bit too much of. He was a little bit too much in the shadows. I mean, he was an okay fighter. He had to shoot people. You know, he just wasn't as much of a hero to me as Doc Savage was. But still, I think it's, if you're getting into this, you should definitely at least read one Shadow book. The Gladiator by Philip Wylie. A lot of people don't know about this, but this is pretty much the precursor for Superman. This book is about a guy whose mother experiments on him and makes him super strong and super fast, and he can jump real high. He's basically kind of like the early Superman. But the interesting part about this book and why I like it so much is that this book is was written in 1930, and yet this take on this super guy is so modern, because he has all these powers, but he's an outcast. You know, he tries to hide because he's ashamed he's going to stand out. He actually has to use his powers to rob sometimes. He's just trying to survive and stay under the radar, because he kind of realizes if people find out he has these powers, then they're going to swarm on him, and maybe for the wrong reasons, to try and find out how he got them, you know, to be threatened by him. He understands that he's a threat to people if they find out he has these powers, and so he kind of has to stay under the radar. Really, really good book. This is a book that he has superpowers, but I think a lot of people might really kind of get the whole theme of, I don't want to stand out. You know, yes, I'm super strong, but I feel like an outcast because I'm nervous of what people will think when they see me. And the last book is the second book series that really, really affected me. Not as much as Doc Savage, which is why Doc Savage is 5 stars, but I really enjoyed this book. Now, this book is another, once again, precursor to superhero prose, because it's about this Confederate soldier who gets out of the army at the end of the Civil War, and he's kind of wandering in the desert. He gets chased by some Indians. He runs into this sacred cave, and this sacred cave mysteriously transports him to Mars. On Mars, because of the lower gravity, he becomes superhuman. And so it's this whole kind of like a Yankee in King Arthur's court thing, where he's this, you know, foreigner, and he's dealing with all these different Martians. It's just interesting to see how all these people react to them. Like I said, he's basically a Superman on Mars, and this is a span of books. Once again, I just read these books and I thoroughly enjoyed them. He could fight because he was a soldier. He could, you know, jump. He was super strong, and all this interesting stuff that occurs to him throughout his path. So those are, I believe, 8 books that I would definitely recommend that I consider superhero fiction. Some might be a little bit superhero fiction adjacent, but they were definitely a big part of my love of superhero fiction. So I hope you give a couple of them a try. And this is Ofori, the digital reader, and keep reading.